Okay, so we had the Ottoman Empire last week. We're moving east. We're moving further into Asia now. And the reason that we're doing that is because this is where things start to get complicated in an interaction sort of way. So I want to talk a little bit about gunpowder. Gunpowder was not discovered, crafted, created in China as an explosive black powder that they refined saltpeter and they made it into a black powder, which is extremely highly flammable and combustible. And then they began putting it in things and throwing them at each other. They would make clay pots and put the gunpowder inside clay pots and then throw them at each other. And that would make a much more effective thing than just throwing rocks. They would also coat the outsides of arrows and contain the gunpowder in the tips of arrows so that they could fire explosive arrows at each other in warfare. Gunpowder is something that changed the way battles happened, because it's one thing to have to run up and hit somebody in the face. It's another thing to be able to set them on fire from a distance. So it changed a lot of the nature of warfare. Because China is on one end of the Silk Road and all of the Middle East is on the other end of the Silk Road, this technology made its way down the Silk Road and landed in what that growing, expanding Islamic, those Islamic empires. And as they did, gunpowder hit the Islamic Golden Age at the same time. So like at the same time that you had scientists who were figuring out how to do medicine and what to do with the stars and how the earth worked, you also had them looking at gunpowder and going, what else could we do with this? This is kind of cool. So during the Islamic Golden Age, Muslim warriors figured out ways to use this gunpowder to create things like cannons. So now instead of having a pot full of gunpowder that you throw, a black powder that you throw at somebody, now you have a device that fires at a long distance and hits a wall with it and explodes the wall. So this is something that took place from about 900 to 1100 AD, was the refining of gunpowder weapons. And then of course, you know, black powder comes into Europe through the Crusades. The Crusades come in, they meet gunpowder face to face, and gunpowder gets introduced into Europe. But further east, whole tribal areas are being conquered by the armies that possess gunpowder weapons. And as they come through and as they conquer these tribal areas, and I say tribal, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I'm not talking about primitive. I'm talking about societies that are still built around a strongman family instead of societies that are built on city-states. So, you know, just in that part of development where they're moving from a village to a network to a walled city, but are not quite part of a country or a kingdom yet, that's what I mean when I say tribal. So gunpowder wielding armies move into these areas and they start to sort of take over and impose themselves as the heads of these areas. So in order to kind of lump them all together, we call them the Gunpowder Empires. Even though they are known for so much more than that, we still kind of call them that, the Gunpowder Empires. It gave them a huge advantage, and wherever they went, after they had come in with their armies and subdued any resistance, they began to introduce their culture, and the culture of the places they went into changed. So we're going to talk about what's called cultural fusion. How do cultures actually combine? And there's two kind of ways that happens. There's syncretism and there's synthesis. And these are two very different things. A good example of syncretism is the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree, as many of you know, is a tradition of Christmas, which is a Christian holiday. But the actual practice of Christmas trees comes from pagan practices, right? So what happens when you take a pagan practice and a Christian overview or outlook moves into that practice and takes it and makes it a part of them is called syncretism. Okay, it's where we meld two things together and what we come up with is part of one and part of the other, but neither is quite exactly what the original was. Okay, the idea of bringing in evergreens into your house to sort of remind you that, you know, spring will return at some point. versus the lighting of the Christmas tree so that you remember the light of the world, all that kind of stuff. It all kind of melds together, but neither one of them is what it started as, but neither one of them has let go of its roots either. That's what syncretism is, okay? A good example of synthesis is the Easter Bunny, which has no basis in pagan belief. It has no basis in Christian belief. There's no practice of Easter eggs that actually comes into this holiday. That was invented as something new. This was something that was brought in as some new way to celebrate. So when you take pieces of an old culture and blend them with pieces of another old culture, and what you end up with is a blend of the two, it's called syncretism. When you take something from an old culture and something from a new culture and you create something completely new to represent both, that's called synthesis, okay? Have I lost you? Are you with me so far? Okay, so set the Christmas tree aside and the Easter bunny aside. When you're talking about a culture, when the gunpowder wielding army marches into an area and imposes their culture on that area, and what they come out with is neither what the marching army had or what was there before they got there, but something else. Is it something that was synthesized, or is it something that is syncretic? Is it something that represents syncretism, or is it something that represents synthesis? Yeah, so we're going to take a look at what happened in the sort of Indian subcontinent with these gunpowder empires, and then maybe you can tell me if you think that's syncretism or synthesis. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, the empires that we're talking about, the gunpowder empires, most of them take their roots from the Mongolians. In about 1200, Genghis Khan, who was a warlord's son who rose to be a warlord himself of a fairly powerful tribe who then took control of other tribes. He was kind of a rolling force to be reckoned with. And he basically pulled his enemies, he set his enemies aside, pulled in his allies, and grew and grew and grew and grew until he was basically right on top of most of Asia.
That was in the picture Mughal, right?
You're thinking of yeah, that you're thinking of Shere Khan.
No, Mughal, the Asian film.
Yeah, but it wasn't Genghis Khan, it was Shere Khan.
Right.
I thought Genghis Khan was the mean man that was going to take it over the whole empire.
Yeah, it just happens later.
Okay.
It's sort of a series of that. But, and also Mulan is arguably, you know, legend, so it's not really 100% accurate anyway. But what happened, the spread of this Mongolian empire is actually something we refer to as the Pax Mongolica, which is the peace of Mongol, which is just like the Pax Romana, which is the peace of Rome. Which, was that particularly peaceful? Do you remember? Was the Roman Empire a place of peace, enduring peace? So calling it the Pax Mongolica is pretty much the same as calling it the Pax Romana. What it meant was that culture and that leadership had spread over such a wide area that all of these areas became interconnected with each other. The Pax Mongolica meant that there were massive transportation systems that were connected to each other that hadn't been connected before, because instead of little patches of tribal leadership, suddenly you had this over-imposed government that took charge of everything, and it all kind of took its roots from Genghis Khan. It all kind of took its roots from him. It fell for a number of reasons. One of them is that it just got too big for itself, like most Pax, most widespread empires do. It just became too big for itself. It fell prey to its own benefits. So all of these wonderful connected roads, you know what you send up and down those roads? You send livestock, and you send technology, and you send disease, and you send interactions between people that wouldn't have interacted before. So you have religions that are coming in. Now, Genghis Khan was what was called a Tengrist. He was a sky worshiper. He worshiped the god of the sky. He was not Islamic. He was not Buddhist or anything like that. He was a Tengrist. But as they started to move into these areas, the beliefs of those areas started to filter up through the Pax Mongolica until leaders in various positions were actually participating in these local religious beliefs, which kind of causes fractures. Now they don't agree on everything. And the biggest thing that broke them apart was the plague. The Pax Mongolica connected all these roads together, and then that made it really easy for really dangerous diseases to spread really quickly. So the Mongol Empire fell apart because of fracturing leadership and because of religious incursions and because of the bubonic plague. After it fell apart, and let's see, if you go back up here, yeah, that's messy. Okay, if I go back up here and show you this part of Genghis Khan broke his kingdom up into 4 sections, his empire up into 4 sections, so that he could place leaders of his choice in charge of those sections. The Yuan, Y-U-A-N, dynasty in China was Genghis Khan's chosen dynasty. And when it fell apart, that was pretty much the end of the Pax Mongolica. And we'll talk about that a little bit on Thursday. From this mess arose a, tug of war for power, a bunch of tribal leaders all trying to pick up the scraps of what used to be the Mongolian Empire. Rose the empire of Timur-Gurgen. You probably may have heard of him as Tamerlane. Tamerlane wasn't related to Genghis Khan, which means that he had to go back and invent a dynasty that was before Genghis Khan. So he had his roots in the local legendary family tree, but he imposed this. Do I talk about that? Yeah. So he wasn't a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, but because of his powerful gunpowder military, he was able to conquer his whole end of the Silk Road. He was able to take over most of the trade network coming out of China and into the Mediterranean. And he was an interesting guy. Sometimes he was very, very diplomatic. Sometimes he came into an area and he negotiated with the tribal leaders, and he navigated marriages and arranged marriages with his upper officers, and he did everything very peacefully. And sometimes he built a whole mountain out of skulls. It just depended on what kind of day he was having. Either way, his empire was built, and it held very strongly as long as he was alive. But it was built very much on his own personality, so it fell apart when he died. This happens over and over again. Somebody will rise and take power, and they'll pull together an empire, and then it'll fall apart because they died. Okay? So the next person to start to pull everything together had to do it by being related to both of these guys. He was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan on his mother's side, and he was a direct descendant of Tamerlane on his father's side. He was Babur, and he pulled together a military specifically for the point of conquering his own local kingdom. When he was 11 years old, his own kingdom had been conquered by the Sunni. Now, you remember we talked about the Safavids, and they were Shiite, and they were up here in like Afghanistan, and that the Sunni kind of spread around and took over after they fell to the Afghani. Well, this is who's, it's not the Ottoman Empire, but it's the eastern end of that Sunni spread. It came into his kingdom. He himself had very strong opinions about Islam. He didn't appreciate it very much at all, but he was captured when he was very young, and managed to find his way into Afghanistan and find the defensive weapons that they used, and then turn around and come back and use those defensive weapons on his own enemies. So, do you need to know all this stuff? Yeah, he decided based on the fact that he now had muskets and cannons that he could invade down into India, which he did. The problem is that the way that cultures worked, it lended itself naturally to things falling apart. It was hard to pull an empire together and keep it together because of the way the culture worked. One thing was, what happens if the King of France dies? Where does the throne go? Right. What if he has 3 sons? They have to take turns, right? And then if one of them has kids, then they go to the grandkids, and you get bumped further back down the line. Well, in the culture of the Middle East, you'd have to split it up between all 3 kids. That would be the only right thing to do. So as soon as somebody pulls together an empire, if he has multiple sons, the empire is going to be divided as soon as he dies. So that's a problem in most of Persia, is that you can't just leave your sons without their own piece of the kingdom. Now maybe your oldest son gets the biggest piece, but everybody gets something. Everybody gets a piece, and then those those pieces war with each other because brotherly love is, well, anyway, so every time a ruler dies, the kingdoms splinter and they fall apart. So when Babar died, his kingdom went to his one son, but his half brother also inherited part of the kingdom, and the part of the kingdom he inherited was a great staging ground for invading back. So Shere Khan, his half brother, formed an army in Kandahar. And I don't want you to get confused. It's Shere Khan, but it's not the Shere Khan that's in Mulan, because that guy was fictional. He was like a super villain that they created out of a bunch of names that somebody had read somewhere, I think, right? I mean, basically, you were talking about the invasion of the Huns, and so this is kind of at the wrong time.
Okay.
So, but the real Shere Khan was a warrior in Afghanistan, and he came down and drove Babar's son into, I'm off, my slides are off, drove his Babar's son into Persia, where he was held captive, and he had to convert and become a Shiite Muslim, which he didn't like, but that was how he had to survive. He returned with the Persian support because he became Shiite. He rose up in the ranks. Y'all remember how all you had to do to rise up in the ranks was show that you were competent and that you converted and that you were, you know, part of the structure and all of that. Well, that was kind of true with the Shiite Muslims too, that he was a member of the royalty from another kingdom. He rose, he converted, not willingly, but he converted. And so he was able to gather the army and the support of the Persians around him and come back and re-attack. And when he did, he defeated Shere Khan and wiped him off the map. And then he tripped on his robe and fell down the stairs and died.
Now that's funny.
Oh, what a pity, poor man. Okay, so that was Babur's son, okay? Humayun was Babur's son. So that was the son that he gave most of his kingdom to. And the half-brother was the one that drove him up into, anyway. I don't know how much of this family tree you need to know. For testing purposes, I think more what you're supposed to get is a general movement of people, like a leader who rises and then finds himself having to make compromises in order to hold things together. So we started off with Genghis Khan, who was a Tengrist, moving into an area that was then converting, meeting up against this Islamic expansion, and then the leaders of those militaries sort of converting slowly to other belief systems. Akbar was 14 years old when his father fell down the stairs and died and tripped on his robe. He was 14 years old, so he was rushed through his military training. And during the time that he was vulnerable, Shere Khan rallied his forces again. Shere Khan wasn't killed by Humayun, but he rallied his forces again and thought that young little Akbar would probably be really easy to defeat. But Akbar was just a boy surrounded by military men, and those military men decided to fight on his behalf and consolidate his kingdom and defeat Shere Khan. So Akbar is really the first one who gets to rise up and take hereditary control of the kingdom that his father left him. Okay, that's really the first time that actually happens, is when it happens to Akbar. I'm gonna give you all a second, and me a second to catch my breath. Okay, so.
Could you imagine, like, people telling your story and it's like, it's amazing, I went and defeated my half brother and, you know, all that, and it's great. And then, how did you die? You know what? I don't want to talk anymore.
Yeah, you gotta feel bad for Humayun. But what that leaves in power is this vulnerable 14-year-old, so Humayun's men have to rally around him. So this is the first time that the kingdom doesn't splinter in between one reign and the next, and it's because he fell down the stairs that happens. So let's talk about Akbar. So he has this segment of his family that is Hindu, and this segment of his family that is unwillingly Shiite, and this segment of his family that is Sunni Muslim. And he decides that he is going to try to consolidate everything under one kingdom without destroying all of the different religions in between. So he decides that he's going to develop a try to reconcile the differences between the Hindus and the Muslims, and he finds out that they both hate him for it.
Wow.
because neither of them wants to compromise. So he ends up being really unpopular because of that. A couple of things that he tries, he, as the descendant of his father, who was a Shiite, marries a Hindu princess. And the Hindu princess buys him access to the Hindu community, the Hindu leadership of northern India. This part of India here is the really settled part, and if you take World Civ I, we talk about that quite a bit, but this valley, the Ganges River Valley, is where most of the big city-states are, and he's taking control of a big chunk of that by the time he takes the throne as a grown man. Underneath his armies have taken charge of a huge chunk of that. So he marries a Hindu princess and then builds her a whole city in honor of the son that they're going to have, which is nice. But he had to maintain control of the Silk Road, and in order to do that, he had to control the Afghanis, who are up here, because the Silk Road goes through here and into the Mediterranean way over here somewhere. So he has to have some control over the Afghanis, which means that he has to go back to war with Kandahar again. Kandahar is in the hands of his uncle, his great uncle. At this point, you have to draw a line back to that half brother, is in the family of his great uncle. So he's going back to war against his own family. And what he runs into is another force that's also trying to take over Afghanistan, which is the Safavids, those Shiite Muslims we talked about before. So he gets right into the middle of this battle over Afghanistan so he can control the Silk Road. So he's a busy guy. But he does manage to succeed. He takes out the remaining forces that are allied against him. He takes out the sultans that don't want to consolidate with the Muslims, the Hindus that don't want to consolidate with the Muslims. He takes them out, and he begins to impose new ministries. Now we can talk a little bit about some of his ministries. He figured out a way to make Sunni Muslims be mostly in charge of things, but not by imposing his will on them, by just making sure they were the ones who always got the promotions. So he set up massive tax networks so that everybody belongs to taxing districts. He set up massive legal systems so that everybody had to abide by the same law, which seems like a small thing, but when you have a country as tribal as India was, the idea of a single legal system that everybody has to answer to, that's quite an undertaking. And then he set up these military households. So he divided his ministry under tax, legal, religious, military, and then the royal household, which was kind of up and above all the rest of that. He would recruit nobles from the local areas to be in those ministry positions, and then he would reward them if they were also Sunni Muslims. And then he would award them with land grants, which is kind of like the system that the Spanish used when they first landed in South America, in Central America, was an encomienda system, where they would land and they say, okay, you are now in charge of making that area productive, which means you can march your troops in and tell the people that are there to do what you tell them to do. So it's kind of that kind of land grant system. One of the things that rises during this time is the position of women. Now, the Muslims and the Hindus have very different ideas of how women should be treated. To the Hindus, everything is based on caste, and caste really, really matters. So everything is broken into caste. They genuinely believe that you're born into your caste and that you have no reason to want to change it. And then men and women within those castes have different roles. So everything is very, important. In the Muslim world, the outer sphere of a household is the responsibility of the male, and the inner sphere of a household is the responsibility of the woman. So the running of the household you could have things that cross both of those, because trading, for example, could affect the outside of the household or the inside of the household. So you'd have to work together, men and women. So during this time, in order to protect the women, sultans began to build harems. And we get the wrong idea about harems because Europeans came in and saw them and were like, oh, I know what this is for. It's a building full of women. And Europeans had a different idea of what was going on in that building. And so harems get kind of a bad rap because of that. They get kind of a bad reputation. But the truth is they were built to protect women. They were built to be a place where women could go about taking care of all of the business they needed to take care of without coming in contact with the men. which is like the opposite of what we think of as a harem for now. But that's actually how they developed. They were actually buildings where women could live peacefully and conduct their business under the supervision of and protection of men. And so access to a harem, the sultan of an area would have a harem full of women that were selling land and buying land and filling out legal paperwork and doing all of their business inside this building where they never had to worry about men coming and interfering with them.
So it's kind of like a sanctuary for.
Yeah, but we didn't, the Europeans got there and they met the sultan and they saw his harem and they went, wow, there's like 200 women in here and you get access to all of them. We know what that's for, because Europeans are gross. Anyway, and I'm speaking about my own people here. So anyway, this was a place of protection. Something else that rose up during Akbar's time was the Sufi belief system. Okay, so you have the Shiite and the Sunni Muslims that all kind of have a different view of exactly how Muhammad's wishes should be fulfilled. But on the other fringes of that, you also have this movement of more spiritual connection, trying to induce a state of euphoria, whirling and tightening something around your neck so that you get dizzy, all these kinds of things that they would do in the hopes that rather than just interpreting the words of Muhammad, maybe you could actually also get your own revelation. If you do enough spiritual release, if you separate yourself enough from your physical body, maybe you can actually, contact God directly and hear what Muhammad heard instead of, feeding it through all of these other belief systems. So this mystic sort of spiritual belief was based in Islam, but it was really easy for the Hindus to understand because it wasn't that different from what they had been doing, with their rituals and with their incantations and their practices in order to achieve some sort of spiritual enlightenment. And so that's Sufism. Akbar really liked Sufism, and his son, Jangahar, was actually raised to really appreciate Sufism. They became themselves sort of Sufi mystics as they were kings. So rather than really being Sunni or Shiite, they kind of drifted towards Sufi Islam. Okay, so if you were in one of these now primarily Islamic Mughal empires, and you yourself were not Muslim, chances are converting to Islam would probably be the best thing you could do. So as they move into the Indian subcontinent and as they start to take over these Hindu areas, there's an incentive for becoming Muslim. It makes your life much easier if you do. It's the reason why it spreads through the areas because, in Hinduism, if you're born into the untouchable caste, there's no way out for you. But if you convert to Muslim, you could end up outranking everybody in the caste above you because now you are Islamic, which means that you outrank everybody who's not. So it's possible to rise out of the caste that you were born into if you convert to Islam. Does that make sense? So Hindu mystical traditions and Sufi mystical traditions are very close, so it's really easy to make that step from one to the other. There are some problems because the upper class Hindus do consider the Muslims unclean, like they're not pure because of some of their practices and because of some of their beliefs. Akbar actually employed Hindu mathematicians. The Islamic Golden Age made use of a lot of the mathematical things that the Indians were doing. So Shah Jahan was Akbar's son, and Shah Jahan was part of that Sufi kind of belief system. Was he Akbar's son? No, his grandson, sorry, Jangahir. I just skipped one. I skipped the whole king. Y'all are gonna miss him. Anyway, his grandson was the first person to actually try to create a more substantial Muslim presence. Okay, so Akbar wanted the societies to meld together, but his grandson, Shah Jahan, wanted something that was more radically Muslim. He wanted to once and for all establish that the Indian subcontinent was going to be Muhammad's people, were going to be Islamic. So he began projects when he took the throne. He wanted everybody to invest in these projects. And 4 years after he took the throne, his wife died in childbirth.
Okay,
And
so Django was John's dad?
this is Akbar's grandson.
Okay. So we missed the whole song.
Yeah, but he really didn't do
He
anything.
didn't do that. Okay, got it.
He was a Sufi too. That's all we really know about Jahangir is that he was a Sufi too. And he didn't live for very long, so, you know, he's sort of unremarkable. Shah Jahan built this building in honor of his dead wife, and this is the Taj Mahal. This is supposed to be both a tomb to commemorate her, but also a representative of what heaven is supposed to look like, according to the Muslim belief system. So he began with the Taj Mahal and then spread that out to a whole bunch of other building projects. If somebody was building a building in a town and it was going to reflect Muslim ideology, it was going to be Muslim architecture, it was going to reflect Islamic beliefs somehow, then he would support that building with his money. If it didn't, he wouldn't, and they'd have to build it on their own. So what happens gradually over time is that Hindu temples start to fall into disrepair and Muslim temples start to rise, and almost like cathedrals just appearing, mosques appearing, you know, great big beautiful mosques appearing in various places because Shah Jahan supported them. So he was the first of this line to actually start trying to transform the Indian subcontinent into a Muslim place, a place where that you could look at and go, wow, this is definitely Islamic, this whole place is. The problem was that he had 4 sons and they were bad to each other. They were like, did y'all ever see the movie Stardust? That's kind of off. You remember how the sons were like killing each other and trying to get down to just one? That was kind of what happened with Shah Jahan's sons. They kept plotting against each other, raising armies against each other until they were down to just one was left, and that one imprisoned Shah Jahan and took over. And the way he was able to do that was by raising an army out of hardcore, non-Sufi Muslim soldiers that had risen up through the ranks, that had come from the original, you know, influx instead of rising up through the Hindu. They weren't Sufi mystic converts. They were like Safavids that had been displaced. They were like Shiite Muslims. So he was able to raise an army that defeated all 3 of his brothers specifically by being more hardcore Islamic than his brothers or his father were. So he put his father in prison and took his empire from him. And he reigned for a pretty good long time. He reigned for about 50 years. And during that time, he conquered the southern half of India, and across the entire continent, he imposed Sharia law.
So this is laying the groundwork for the whole Hindu.
Yes. Yeah, and as we get into the 20th century, you'll see that there's still, this animosity is still there. The Hindu versus Muslim animosity is still there. But the thing is that the practice of Islam in the Indian subcontinent doesn't look like the practice of Islam in the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't look like that. And the practice of Hinduism in the Indian subcontinent begins to change shape too. So, yeah, are we running out of time? We're getting there. Okay, we still got a little bit of time. Let's talk just for a minute about what Sharia law actually means. Because I think we have as Americans, we have kind of a knee-jerk reaction when we hear Sharia law. We think of women getting stoned because their heads aren't covered. You know, the imposition of Sharia law. Sharia law means, literally, it means divine law. It means law that's been handed down directly from heaven. That's all the word Sharia means. So that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. I think you would agree. The 4 sources of justice under Sharia law are the Quran, which are Muhammad's writings, which is his writings about what he saw and what he heard from heaven. The Hadith, which are things Muhammad said when he was preaching that other people wrote down. And the Ijma, which is a consensus of all of the disciples of Muhammad and all their followers later. And that gets edited over time. And then finally, the act of common sense. So justice can come from any or all of these 4 sources. So if somebody is facing a need for justice, it can come from the Muhammad's actual writings, or he can find the basis for that in what he taught, or he can find the basis for that in enough people thinking that's the most logical thing that needs to happen. In order to put all of these legal sources together, you have to have judges, and so judges are appointed. They're called muftis, and they hear cases before fatwas, before issuing fatwas, which are judgments. So those words are probably words you've heard if you pay any attention to foreign news at all. You know that, for example, Osama bin Laden issued a fatwa, and that judgment was against all Western governments, basically. He issued a judgment, and people acting on that judgment bombed buildings. So this is the origin of that, is the judgment, is fatwa, was that it was supposed to be just, you know, a way to settle disputes using holy law. The son who imprisoned the father imposed Sharia law, but he didn't do it with violence. He just turned his back on anybody who wasn't Muslim. He rewarded nobles who practiced Islam and kicked out the ones who didn't. So the punishment was losing all of the status that you had had for centuries because of who your family was, to somebody who has risen and converted to Islam and being outranked by them. And he imposed it. He went through his cities and made sure that that was what was going on. It wasn't just sort of a basic practice that we'll kind of get into. It was a let's audit the whole system and make sure that all of the people in charge are practicing Islam. And the end result of that is discrimination against people who aren't. Okay, so talking about India as a culture, India still to this day is still a melting pot of religions. Okay, it is, and you can go to India and you can find people who are still Tangrist. You can find people that are Hindu, Islamic, Sufi, Christian, Buddhist. So India as a culture is the product of what? Syncretism or synthesis?
Syncretism,
Okay, why do you say that?
because all of them is melted together.
Okay, because it's melted together and it's retained all the pieces of the old in the new thing that it's created? Somebody over here said synthesis.
I did.
Okay, why do you say synthesis?
Because they changed it to something totally different. It wasn't, or they were doing exactly what the first set did. They
Mhm.
kind of implemented it along the way.
Okay, what about our Zoom people? What do y'all think? Synthesis or syncretism?
I think it's synthesis.
Okay, how come?
Just because it seems more like the difference between wait, did I say synthesis? Because I think I actually meant syncret.
We believe in you.
Syncretism.
There it is.
Because it seems more like they're taking the things that they learned in the spiritual ways and stuff like that, and then they're kind of making their own and then dropping it on top and saying, hey, this is ours, you know?
Okay, so is that more like a Christmas tree or like an Easter egg?
Like a Christmas tree.
Okay, all right. So what did India, the Indian subcontinent, look like before the Pax Mongolica? What did it look like before the Mongolians came in? Yeah, they were tribal Hindus. Okay, and what does that mean? Great big buildings and city-states with ritual practice areas and all that kind of stuff?
No, it means more of the kind of ritualistic animism kind of.
Yeah, okay, so the Mongolians come in, and then as a result of that incursion, it opens the door for Islamic forces to come in, and then the leaders who are related to Genghis Khan are also related to these people, so it comes in and they create something. So they create something completely different from what was there before, but also something that didn't exist really in any form, or do they create something that's a melding of the old to create the new?
I know, like, one of the guys, he said some of the practices from Hinduism and said it was Islamic, and like kind of melded those two together to make it easier for them to convert to Islam.
Right, as it was in this melting pot that Sufism was born. So Sufism we don't find Sufis in the Ottoman Empire. We don't find Sufists? I don't know, we don't find people practicing Sufi Islam in the Ottoman Empire. So that's something that's actually born in this place. That's something new that gets born here. But is it rooted to the old, like a Christmas tree, or is it something created completely new, like an Easter egg?
Easter egg.
Okay.
You call them Sufi.
Yeah, I think you're right. Sufi. You just call them Sufi. Okay.
Which is,
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. What are you asking me for? Why would I know the answer to that? The value is in the question. Are we looking at the
Show us how
creation
they
of something new? Huh?
Show us how they spin.
No.
Well, what do you think it is?
I really genuinely think something new was born here. I think that this is synthesis. I think that they create something new out of the pieces of all these old, and what they have as a result is something that's extremely that's bound up in a lot of tension. And I think that as we study India in the 20th century, you'll begin to see that there was never going to be a time when the beliefs of India and the beliefs of China, even though they might both be Islamic at one point, would be close enough to the same thing that they would consider themselves the same people.
That's how we have the issue of Tibet.
That's why we have Tibet.
So you're calling
And we
it
will
tension-
definitely
you're
talk
calling
about
it
that.
Tension synthesis. I think it's
Yeah.
syncretism.
You think it's syncretism because of the
You're calling
tension?
the tension, the synthesis. They still came together and intermingled and made. I mean, they're still combining.
I don't know if y'all on Zoom can hear this. Chris is saying that he believes that this is an example of syncretism because they brought all this together and combined it, and now it just exists
The only thing new
like a
is the
perpetual
tension.
tug of war. The only thing new is the tension, Chris says.
Well, not necessarily new, but that was
All right,
created.
anybody else want to offer anything from our Zoom world? Anybody else want to respond? How about in here in the classroom? Okay, all right, so here's what we're gonna do going forward. Can y'all see my Blackboard on Zoom? Am I sharing the right screen?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so you have a document this week that we're gonna be talking about. It's under class materials, and we're in week 3, Asia. This is a letter that was written by St. Francis Xavier from the Society of Jesus in Europe. He wrote it to the Society of Jesus in Europe while he was traveling through Japan. And we're going to talk about China and Japan on Thursday. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and take a look at this letter. And this is going to be the assignment that's due. What were some of the differences of belief that Francis Xavier ran into that made converting the Japanese to Christianity difficult? And this is going to be due on Sunday, but go ahead and take a look at the document and start thinking about your answer to this question. What kind of difficulties is he talking about? And then, so on Thursday, we will talk about a little bit about China and a little bit about Japan, and we'll just sweep east. We'll just move east. Okay, any questions? All right, we've still got about 10 minutes, so if you've got any questions about your paper or anything like that, now is the time.
You get this seats from Suki.
Yes and no. You're like, Mindy. I know, I'm sorry, that's frustrating. Actually, that's because of the incursion of Buddhism into Islam. So, like, you have to move just a little bit further east before you start to really see a whole lot of that.
I'm going to assume we're going to be covering Gandhi.
Yeah, what?
I'm just saying.
Eventually. I mean, we got to get all the way to the 20th century to cover Gandhi. So, but think about that. You already see the roots of that movement if you just watched this. Anyway, you can already sort of see it blossoming, the thing that will eventually produce Gandhi. Okay, any questions? Y'all good?